My name is Wendy Sukier, and I'm a professor at Toronto Metropolitan University, formerly known as Ryerson. We're here to speak as part of the Generous Future series on supporting refugee resettlement. And this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I lead the Diversity Institute, but I'm also the child of a refugee. I was involved in Operation Lifeline, which resettled Indo-Chinese refugees in the late 70s, co-founder of the Ryerson University Lifeline Syria Challenge in 1995. And I'm one of the founders of Lifeline Afghanistan and now doing work with Ukrainian refugees as well. So this is a topic that I think is critically important. Before we get started, I wanted to acknowledge that we're on the traditional unceded territory of the Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Chippewa, and the Wendat peoples. And regardless of where you're joining from us across this country, we have many from north to south and east to west. You're joining us from traditional territories of Indigenous peoples. I understand we have others from other parts of the world, and I want to welcome all of you. I also wanted to take this opportunity to thank our lead sponsor, TD Bank Group, for helping to advance this great initiative. And we can see every day stories of conflict around the world and forced migration and refugee movements. And so this topic, I think, is very timely. Now, I'm delighted to introduce our very illustrious panel, and I'll start with the Honorable Ratna Ahmedvar, who is really needs no introduction. Her reputation is international. She became a senator in 2016, and she is an independent senator representing Ontario. She's chair of the Senate Standing Committee on Social Affairs, Science and Technology, and was deputy chair of the Senate Special Committee on the Charitable Sector. So this topic is also near and dear to her heart. Previously, she was at our university as a distinguished visiting professor and founded the Global Diversity Exchange at the Diversity Institute. So welcome, Senator Ahmedvar. Our next speaker is Sajjad Ibrahim, who is a well-regarded leader in business and entrepreneurship, and really a philanthropist without compare. He's the president of the Sajjadia Trust, as well as CEO of Lark Investments Inc. Canada. He's devoted to many social and philanthropic initiatives, has been deeply involved in advancing education, housing, welfare, and healthcare in developing countries, but also in Canada. And he played a very significant role in supporting the Ryerson University Lifeline Syria Challenge, now obviously at Toronto Metropolitan University. He also received an honorary doctorate recognizing his contributions in 2019. So welcome to you, Dr. Ibrahim. And our next panelist is Bayan Katib, who is the co-founder of the Syrian Canadian Foundation, and we work together on Syrian refugees as well. And the foundation aims to empower newcomers and people of diverse backgrounds, as well as to promote cross-cultural connections within Canadian society. She also co-founded the annual Syrian Film Festival in Toronto and is the author of several short works of fiction, as well as many opinion pieces that have been published nationally. Currently, she's the impact manager of the Refugee Newcomers Investment Portfolio at the North Pine Foundation, which is an innovative foundation, one of the largest in the country with dedicated funding for refugees. And we're really grateful all of you have made time to join us today. So I'll start simply by asking one question. Why is this important? Given all of the things that we could support with our time and our money, why should why should we be particularly preoccupied with refugees? And I'll start with you, Senator Ahmedvar.
Thank you, Wendy, and thank you so much, colleagues, and audience for tuning in to this really important and timely webinar. So I'll answer the why quite simply, Wendy. Because Canada is not an island that lives in glorious isolation from what happens in the rest of the world. We might be far removed from countries of conflict, but we know from the past and we know from history that if we do not address issues of displacement in other parts of the world, that displacement ultimately has an impact of how we live our lives and how secure and prosperous we are. Just as one example, the refugee camps in Kenya have housed a generation already. We have to think what that generation of living in limbo means for young people, what it means for their education, what it means for their future. We know from data that children are easily seduced into crime, or worse, trafficked, and all kinds of very dangerous situations can involve. So before it hurts us here, it is in our self-interest. I know we talk about compassion, but I believe very firmly being responsive to what's happening in other parts of the world is ultimately in the interest of Canadians. And that is why we should be paying interest to refugees, regardless whether they are from Ukraine today or Afghanistan yesterday, and who knows where else tomorrow.
Thank you so much. And how about you, Dr. Ibrahim?
Yes, I think one cannot even imagine the plight of people living a lifetime in a refugee camp, children growing up without education, without healthcare and all those things. It's a very, very sad situation. And one of the earliest examples of how refugees were settled was by Prophet Muhammad. When he immigrated from Mecca to Medina, and a lot of Muslims followed him, what he did was he basically got each refugee to partner with a family that was living in Medina. And that's how they got settled when they arrived in Medina. And we are doing the same thing over here right now. We are taking 5 families that are responsible for settling the refugees. And I think that's a wonderful way of doing things. I've felt very strongly about refugees and was involved in with friends in sponsoring refugees from Vietnam, from Ethiopia, from Bosnia. And then when this Syrian Lifeline challenge came about, I thought I had the opportunity to make a much bigger impact, which I thought was a wonderful way of doing it. You had families that were helping families. There was students that were getting a lot of experience, and it was a compassionate thing to do. And the funding was provided by some people. I think the Canadian government has done an excellent job with the Ukrainian refugee crisis. And I think they can do the same with other countries. We have an obligation to the Afghan people that work for the Canadian embassy over there, and they are being left in limbo. And in Canada, it's a humanitarian thing, the refugees, but it's also a nation building. Canada needs more immigrants, and we've got 1 million jobs outstanding right now with people that can fill it. So I think it's a win-win situation for everybody, and I think it's a very, very good thing for Canada to do. But get rid of the bureaucracy and let's get going on it.
Thanks so much, and I love you sharing the history effectively of private sponsorship. That's something to really note. How about you, Bayan? Can you talk a little bit about your experience and why you think this is a priority?
Thank you, Wendy. Like Senator Ahmedvar said, we live in a globalized world. We are all interconnected, and also any one of us can become a refugee. We are all vulnerable. War, insurrection, climate change. Becoming a refugee is a hardship that nobody sees coming and nobody chooses. So we need to be there for each other. Many of you might know that Canada resettles more refugees than any other country. And although we bring these refugees here for humanitarian reasons, we actually need these newcomers for Canada to thrive. We have a crashing dependency ratio, which means not enough working people to support our aging population. We can read more about this at the Century Initiative, of which Senator Ahmedvar is a board member. So once these newcomers are here, it is in their and our best interest to make sure that they succeed and reach their full potential, which means meaningful work that matches their skill set and education, getting licensed to practice in their fields, getting the mental health support they need to overcome trauma so that they can be at their best. And every single one of us has an important role to play in all of this. We must do our part to create the welcoming and inclusive communities that ensure success for refugee integration. So ask yourself today, what could I do to help? Can you reach out to a refugee, help them make new friends, introduce them to your networks? If you're an employer, whether big or small, have you tapped into refugee talent? Have you adopted refugee-friendly hiring practices? If you're not sure what that entails, you could reach out to organizations like Jumpstart Refugee Talent, a great nonprofit that's solely focused on connecting refugees to meaningful employment and providing training to employers who want to hire refugees. And they're also launching a hiring platform, which will make that whole process easier. So if you're stuck on the how, please do reach out to me. I would be happy to explore that with you.
Thanks very much. And I think the point about combining humanitarian commitments with enlightened self-interest is really important. And the evidence, most of you around the table experience this, is that, of course, refugees, like other newcomers, often face impediments when they first come, but they do very well over time, and their children outperform the children of people born in Canada in terms of educational attainment, work ethic, and so on. So I would say it's, as all of you had, it's definitely important for all of us. Senator Ahmedvar, back to you. You've been advocating since as long as I've known you on a variety of issues that would help government better harness, leverage private philanthropic dollars generally, and specifically to help support refugees. Can you tell us a little bit about the work you've been doing and the priorities you see?
I believe that if the government could be persuaded to take a systems approach, a structural approach, a policy approach to generating Canadian support for refugees, it could do so through a variety of instruments that are in their reach. I'll talk about these, but in essence, I believe that the limits on private sponsorship should be lifted. These are artificial boxes we find ourselves in. We cannot seem to get out of them. And I think these limits are counterproductive because they leave private sponsors waiting in line, sometimes for 4-5 years for their file to move ahead. They should make it simpler, not harder. Currently, the government is actually making it harder for private sponsorship and sponsorship agreement holders to do their work by calling for, all kinds of accountability measures. And I'd be the first to say accountability is important. But I also think that it is time for this movement to start calling for a change in how charitable dollars are provided exemption for. Private sponsors at this point do not get a charitable exemption for sponsoring refugees. There are complicated structures which you have to go through. And Wendy, you know about these better than I do, because during Lifeline Syria, you made that possible for private sponsors to get charitable exemption, so that we raised in Lifeline Syria, I don't know how many millions of dollars we raised, and all those refugees are settled. I have 20 of those refugees that we settled, partly, because the money was a lot of money to raise, and that exemption really helped. But we must, instead of making it accidentally possible, we must make it systemically possible. And private sponsorship releases not just money, it releases social capital for the refugees. It glues the community of sponsors together. I could go across the country anytime. I know I could find a private sponsor to have a cup of coffee with. How powerful is that? Through the country, from the East Coast to the West, private sponsors are scattered all over the country, and I could go and have a cup of coffee with any one of them and talk about my experiences. That's nation building today. It's not hard infrastructure of railways. It's the soft infrastructure of people holding together on a common cause. So, I think all these things are possible, but movements like this need to start asking for that. And I would hope, Wendy, as a result of this webinar, we come out of this with some action that is required at the system structural level. And that's important. I also was able to amend the Income Tax Act so that charities in Canada can work more easily with non-charities in a relationship. This will free charitable dollars for charities who are located in Canada to work with refugee helping communities overseas, as long as it's in their charitable purpose, or refugee supporting communities in Canada. This will, now the bill will be approved this week or next week. It will be given royal assent, but this is a new era for charitable dollars to engage in public good. So I think there's lots of avenues, but I would really encourage this webinar and its audience to come out of it with a 5-step action plan, in a way, to generate more changes, more structural systemic changes in law and policy.
And we will have an opportunity to follow up with those asks after the webinars. So thanks for that. I wanted to underscore what you said about nation building. 3 million Canadians were involved in one way or another with Syrian refugees. That was one of the most powerful antidotes to Islamophobia that we could have had, in fact, because those personal connections are so important. And as Senator Ahmedvar mentioned, some of the families, for example, that Dr. Ibrahim supported, settled in Cape Breton. One is a dentist who is now serving the community in St. John's, Newfoundland. So the idea that this is just an issue for big cities, I think, is really misleading and something people sometimes forget. So, Dr. Ibrahim, maybe you can tell us more about your experience and how, as a business leader, you see this as being important.
Thanks, Wendy. So basically, I do feel that every Canadian has to do what is best for Canada. And there's nothing better than getting refugees here and giving them an opportunity. And they are, if we look at the statistics, they are so patriotically Canadian in terms of the opportunities that this country has given them. And they are really good Canadian citizens. Canada needs the number of people to come here. So it's not just humanitarian, it's also nation building. And to give an example of, I've heard about Danby Appliances, and Jim has, well, the owner, and they have committed to sponsoring 50 families from the Guelph area with partnerships with other people in that area. Businesses can offer jobs and training. They can provide goods at a discount. And there are lots of economic benefits that come from these. When you forgot to mention one of the families that we had sponsored from Montreal that were able to then sponsor 20 other refugees from their extended families. So, and if you really look at the statistics in terms of what the refugees as they go on to become Canadian citizens, etc. I mean, they, in terms of their education, in terms of their giving, in terms of their entrepreneurship, and all these things, they're actually, it's very heartwarming to see how well they do once they get settled. And the interaction, I think the Lifeline Syria Challenge was such an interesting concept in terms of getting the funders, the families, and especially the students. I thought that was the best part of the whole thing, getting the students to help the refugee families and make them part of the whole process. And I think that's a very, very rewarding experience.
Yeah, and you know, one of the things that we also know is refugees, and think about it, it makes sense. Refugees are more likely to be entrepreneurs and
Right.
start businesses because to leave your country and to start over requires a certain kind of strength and initiative. And there's some excellent examples of businesses started by newcomers. Right now, frankly, we have more jobs than we have refugees. You know, major company came to us, said we have 5,000 jobs. At that point, we didn't have 5,000 Afghans who had arrived in Canada. I think now we're up to 15,000. So we really, you know, building on what Senator Omadvar said, we really have to work together to accelerate this process. And how about you, Bayan? I know that you've been you mentioned earlier that you've got some innovative, interesting projects. I think you had mentioned one focused on rural communities in particular. Do you want to tell us a little bit about some of the work you're funding?
Yeah, sure. I also wanted to tell a little bit of a story about my work before getting to the North Pine Foundation. So as you mentioned, Wendy, I had spent 6 years starting up and building a charity called the Syrian Canadian Foundation. And we were working really hard to respond to the needs of refugee newcomers, but we found ourselves being pulled in other directions by what funders wanted to see and what funders wanted to measure. And we'd sign up for funding agreements that would bind us to activities and outcomes and budget lines all set by funder priorities and nearly impossible to move around. And this made it very hard for us to respond to the changing needs of the community. It made it hard to be innovative. If you want to be innovative, you have to be flexible. You need to be able to learn and iterate and tweak as you go. So this is how the North Pine Foundation hopes to be different. We want to do funding in a way that is conducive to innovation and continuous learning, and that only cares about the final outcome. We want to find ways to hold ourselves accountable to the communities we serve, because we believe that leads to best outcomes as well. So I do want to tell you about one of the exciting initiatives that we're supporting right now in partnership with the Refugee Center in Montreal. So we all know that refugee resettlement today predominantly occurs in Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, the big cities. And those cities have major barriers to integration, like high cost of living, unaffordable rent, competition for jobs, high demand on resettlement resources. So we're piloting a refugee relocation initiative to test the hypothesis that settling refugees in smaller towns will reduce barriers to settlement and significantly cut integration time. The first focus we have will be relocating refugees that match labor shortages in those small towns. And this will tackle the meaningful employment piece and also setting up refugees for financial independence. But a very important second focus is figuring out how to create a sense of belonging, which we believe is key to retention and to making sure that these refugees stay in these smaller towns and truly call it home. So in exciting news, we've chosen Moncton, New Brunswick as the first town for relocation. And I just came back last week from visiting Moncton with the Refugee Center team. Moncton is growing at an incredible pace, and they are very keen to bring newcomers to their town. And we're working very closely with the local community there to make sure that we have buy-in from everybody. And we will be moving our first families in just a few short weeks, actually. So I'm really excited about how this initiative sets up a win-win situation for everybody involved. And we're hoping that the pilot will be successful, and then we'll take it to next steps.
Yeah, it's interesting because some of our most successful initiatives were in smaller communities because, as you said, affordability was a big issue. And even if there wasn't a large community of Syrians, for example, often the hospitality and welcoming nature of smaller communities, once you get over those initial hurdles, provide higher levels of support than you would see in the GTA, where people don't talk to each other on the street or in elevators. So thanks very much for that. So Senator Ahmedvar, the series is about generosity, and it really, I think you've touched on this a little bit, but it does dovetail with your work in reconceptualizing philanthropy and the charitable sector. Can you tell us a little bit about that? You've touched on it, but maybe you can elaborate more.
So this whole conversation about the real meaning of philanthropy, the real potential in philanthropy, has sort of been amplified over the COVID crisis, and a lot of conversations have been happening. And I think more and more people are in a different corner from generosity. Generosity is usually about the donor. It is not about the recipient. And so there is a move to shifting from the donor to the community, from generosity to justice, from privilege to equity. So I think that whole conversation is a fascinating one. Structured philanthropy in Canada is in the hands of a few people who control roughly $80 billion worth of assets in this country. And most of these assets, not all, but most of them, have come about as a result of the tax exemption. And so the question really is, whose money is it? How are they accountable for it? And so the who of the persona of philanthropy is also being called into question. After all, if the people who are making the decisions have no connection or no connection is the right word, I guess, to people who are poor, who are racialized, who are refugees, then it is more likely than not, and this is proven by research, it is more likely than not that they will overlook these communities and give generously to the communities they are connected with. As a simple example, very simple example, many philanthropists give to universities, hospitals, and museums. I don't have any trouble. I mean, Wendy, you're at a university. I was associated with a university. I don't have any trouble with that. But every decision you make to fund one kind of intervention, you're also making a decision not to fund something else. And how do you resolve all that? So I think it gets to the who. I mean, let's make a real push, and I will be making a push in the Senate again in trying to change a law so that boards of directors of charities, not-for-profits, philanthropic foundations must disclose their demographics in the same way that we ask corporate Canada to do. We're not sort of saying do more. We're just saying we expect charities, not-for-profits, and foundations to be in tune with the population of Canada, just as we expect Canadian corporations to do so. So that's the who. And the what is I think, going to come from the sector itself. There is a bend towards justice. There's a bend towards reconciliation. There's a bend towards nation building. I love the example that Bayan gave of resettling refugees in Moncton. And I think that hypothesis uh, needs to be tested, because we have a lot of anecdotal evidence, but we don't actually have sort of over time a study done that says people tend then to stick. So there's a lot we have to think about in terms of the what, the who, and the how of philanthropy. And the time is absolutely right now to do so.
I just wanted to follow up on that, because the one thing that museums and universities and hospitals have in common are buildings. And historically, a lot of philanthropists seem to be preoccupied with defining their legacy in terms of having their name on a physical structure. But you've done a lot of work on things like social finance and impact investing and innovative strategies for crowdfunding, things like that. Do you have a comment on sort of shifts that you've observed in how people are seeing legacy these days as opposed to bricks and mortar?
I think the shift is not there yet. I don't see it yet, but I do see it coming, primarily because the legacy will be transferred to the children. And the second generation of philanthropists is less, I believe, less enamored by names on buildings, which is frankly, going back to my first point, it's about the donor. But it is the second generation of philanthropists which will see through the real legacy of philanthropy, which is to shift systems and structures, to bring new investments into the field through social finance. I think that's a really promising idea that takes us away from grant-based contributions and charity to investments. That is what social finance, it's about investments with return and leaving a public legacy. Imagine what a social housing impact fund could produce for our country. Imagine. And the philanthropists would be investing in their legacy, plus they would get their money back with some return, which they could then invest in the next legacy. So that is, I'm not an economist or anything of that kind, but I hear good common sense when I hear it.
Yeah. And, I think, again, Dr. Ibrahim's contribution to the Ryerson University Lifeline Syria Challenge had that evergreen capacity, because the funding wasn't designated even for one particular family. It was whoever needed it. And then the money came back and kept growing and growing. And the multiplier, to me, we think about multiplier effects. If I spend $1, how many dollars is this going to generate in the future, as opposed to something that is fixed? So, Mr. Ibrahim, can you talk a little bit about how you prioritize your initiatives? And I know with the Syrians, you focused on the most vulnerable. I mean, that was the criteria, where it wasn't the easy ones, it was the tough ones that you were most interested in. Can you talk a little bit more about how you make those decisions?
Sure. I think the Holy Quran, the book of the Muslims, talks about giving with your right hand without your left hand knowing, unless there is reason to let others follow in your footsteps. And I think most scriptures talk about the same thing. And I think that if you have saved, again, the Quran says, if you have saved one life, you've saved humanity. And I'm sure the other scriptures say the same thing as well. So I think in terms of the refugees is something that you're basically, instead of the life of the individual spending in a refugee camp and the children growing up without any education, I think that's such a disservice that anybody can do to any human being. And so that becomes a big priority for me and my family. that if we can save a life, if we can save a family, that becomes a very, very important aspect. I've also, another charity that is very close to my heart is something that my grandfather had started in 1959, where we send teams of doctors into villages all over Pakistan and do cataract eye surgery. And we've done over 1.3 million over that time, and do about 70,000 surgeries a year. So things like, if you like, making a major difference in somebody's life is something, and the impact that it creates, not only for them, but also for their families and for the communities that they live in. I think that those are the areas that really are very, very close to my heart.
Well, and it's interesting that your faith is such a big driver for your contributions, but the impact is so broad in terms of the people that are affected. How about you, Bayan? Can you tell us a little bit about, being the youngest of us all, what you see as the future, what you'd like to see in the next 5 to 10 years?
Like you said, Wendy, I'm the impact manager for refugee newcomers at the Northline Foundation. So it's my job to make investments that will improve outcomes for refugees across Canada. And I've decided to focus my work in a few different areas, and I wanted to share them with you. The first is connecting refugees to meaningful employment that matches their skill set and education, and figuring out pathways for licensing for internationally trained professionals with a focus on doctors, which I know is a very difficult mission, but I have my heart set on solving that one. And then the second is a focus on private sponsorship. I'm really proud of Canada's private sponsorship program. It is a model to the rest of the world, but it is run by some of the best of Canadians, basically amazing, hardworking volunteers. It is not an area that many have invested resources into, like Senator Ahmedvar said. So I really want to see, find ways for us to maximize the potential of Canada's private sponsorship program, and to make it easier and less costly in terms of time and money for sponsor groups to sponsor refugee families. And I know there are creative ideas out there. I'm talking to groups right now to figure out how to come up with creative ideas to improve the private sponsorship space in Canada. And lastly, I also really want to focus on supporting refugee claimants, because these are the refugees that face the most challenges and the most barriers and are underinvested. Often refugee claimants aren't even eligible for government-funded programming, as you know, and that doesn't make any sense to me, because Canada actually accepts the majority of refugee claimants. Some years it's up to a 70% almost acceptance rate. So does it make sense for us to neglect them as they're awaiting for their results, or to support their integration as they wait 2, 3, or even more years for their papers to come through? So another important point about refugee claimants is that when we support their integration, it actually helps their legal case and improves acceptance rates. So it's another really important reason why it's important to work with refugee claimants. And as I delve deeper into all of this work, I've actually made a little list of like my big dreams that I have for refugees in Canada, and I wanted to share it with you guys. It's just a short list of 4 items for now, but growing. So like I said, I want to create pathways for internationally trained doctors to have equal access to residency spots in Canada, which is the main pathway to getting licensed here. I'm on a WhatsApp group with like 200 immigrant doctors who are trying to figure out what to do here and hopefully not end up driving taxis. So that's one of my dreams. Second one is to create pathways for home ownership for refugees. Again, it's a very interesting space for innovative financing ideas and all of that. So I'm looking into that with some partners as well. And the third one is related to refugee claimants. And it's a specific one, which is that for refugee claimants to not have to pay international student fees for post-secondary education. This is a huge barrier to education for them. They await for years and years for their outcomes, and it just doesn't make sense for them not to go on with their lives and continue their education as they're waiting. They need to be eligible for domestic fees in post-secondary studies. And finally, the last one, which is a very timely dream, is for Canada to use its response to the Ukrainian crisis to develop an objective framework for rapid response to refugee crisis, an objective framework, one that is not responsive to media coverage or political pressure, but rather based on humanitarian need. So this is the time for that. And I'm really grateful to have this opportunity to share my vision for refugees in Canada with you. I wanted to share it because I'm hoping to meet transformational leaders that will work with me to make these things happen. So please do reach out to me if you want to chat about any of these topics.
Thanks so much. And I have to, there are two things that I just can't resist bringing up because they really highlight your vision. Just last week, one of my former students runs something called Internationally Trained Medical Doctors, which really underscores what you were saying, Bayan. We have physicians coming to Canada who register at the University of Buffalo to do their training, get registered in the US because the reciprocity agreement is a much faster pathway than if they come to Canada. 7 Afghan doctors were directed by a settlement agency to do a 4-month program training them to be a personal support worker. Towards the end of the 4-month program, they were told, oh, sorry, the program was not accredited, but still you may have a chance to earn minimum wage emptying bedpans with a personal support agency. And in my mind, and this goes to one of the questions that was raised, I think, and Senator Almodvar would know this from having worked in the settlement agencies. I don't blame the settlement agencies. They get funded for certain programs. And so you walk through the door, they have a personal support worker program. That's what they're going to register you in. But it is criminal in my mind, when we have such a high percentage of Canadians who don't have family doctors, to see that happening. And the other story I wanted to share is a number of universities have stepped up. We've been doing work with university and college presidents. George Brown and some of the others have actually waived tuition fees for refugees. But my story here is that a student registered at a university in Canada, completed his first term at a distance from Kabul, then applied for a student visa and was turned down because they did not believe he would return to his home country. There are absolutely bizarre provisions in the current regime that are completely at odds with the things we started talking about in terms of Canada's interests in attracting the best and the brightest and meeting the needs of businesses to address labor shortages. So those are just two things that have happened in the last couple of weeks that should be high on the list for people's interventions. At this point, I did want to open it up to some of the questions. I feel that some have actually been asked. For example, someone had asked the question, how can we shift the paternalistic narratives around refugees to better understand how refugees have and will contribute to Canada? I think all of you have talked about that a little bit, but I wonder if anyone would like to add something that hasn't yet been addressed. How do we shift the narrative?
Well, if I may, Wendy, I'm not going to answer directly that question, but I am going to put a bit of the white elephant in the room. Our response to Ukraine versus our response to Afghanistan clearly tells us that these are very deep waters, and I am getting overwhelmed every day. I cannot even tell you the number of emails I get from Afghan refugees who clearly meet, at least on the face of it, the criteria set out by the government. And whereas the government has provided non-refugee routes to the Ukraine, to Ukrainian displaced people, because the situation is different. Ukrainians will want to go back at some point. They don't have a Taliban that's in government there. The Afghans will all likely not. So there are differences at play. And I think as politicians, as one, I have to appreciate that there's a difference. But there is no doubt in my mind that there is a certain amount of Islamophobia at play. And we must talk about that. We were successful in overcoming our fear, if I may call it that, during the Syrian refugee crisis. I mean, the country, do you remember, Wendy, we couldn't produce refugees fast enough for the sponsoring families. We just were torn apart on that. So I have to ask myself, what's the difference here? Is it a kind of class issue that's coming in, because Syrians are reportedly highly educated, although one of the Syrian families I sponsored came from a farm, and they had very little English. The kids had no education, but they're doing really well. Yeah, they bought their house. They're dying to vote in the next election, what have you. So I think that question needs to be a little taken apart, hopefully by academics. I think research and analysis should lead before emotion takes over, because right now it's a highly charged debate, even as the Senate embarks today on its first ever study of Islamophobia in Canada.
I think, I mean, you've answered your own question. And one of the things that for me, because I do sadly a lot of work on extremism and hate groups, one of the things that I find the most frustrating in that whole discussion is that we know the biggest threat to national security in Canada is from right-wing white supremacists. The evidence is very clear. So that's why I keep coming back to how we shift narratives, because the deeply embedded Islamophobia and the talk about security risks has nothing to do with the reality. Does anyone else want to jump in on how we shift the narrative around refugees? Or maybe, sorry,
I
go
would
ahead.
just add very, very quickly, every single refugee I've ever met over the years is so grateful to the opportunity to live in a wonderful country like Canada, and so eager to give back and contribute and become a part of their communities. We just need to give them a chance and support them in that. And that's the narrative we need to bring out, is that refugees are here to contribute to our communities, and we need to support them in that. That's it.
I think that's a great point.
I think, Wendy, what the Diversity Institute and the university is doing, I think if we can get more sort of things out in the public in terms of how the refugees have come and how they're contributing to Canada and how they're actually helping nation building, I think that would really be helpful. And people would then hear all the good stories, and how at one point in time, it was the thing was that immigrants are taking away our jobs. I think the country has now come to the conclusion, and the narrative is that immigration is good for Canada, and without immigrants, Canada is going to become, the growth in Canada is going to become slower and slower if we don't have the population like we've seen in Japan. So I think that narrative can be changed, because the narrative for immigrants was changed. And so now we need to change the narrative for refugees.
And you know, just one of the points that you'd raised in one of our earlier calls is the fact that for those who are, you know, career philanthropy professionals on the call today, dollar for dollar, newcomers and refugees tend to contribute more, regardless of their income level, in
Right.
terms of charitable donations than people born in Canada. So even if you're just being instrumental about the contributions, it's very clear that the evidence is that refugees become an asset, not a liability. I am conscious of the time, and I want to get through some of the other questions. I'll save one of them for all of you to ask in the end. But from your perspectives, um, here's an interesting question. What should the priority or the balance be between supporting refugees in their ethnic enclaves versus trying to engage them with other Canadians? So someone says, when I first arrived in Canada as a refugee in 2009, I was continually referred to resources according to my ethnicity and cultural background, which I feel hindered my integration. So what is it that we can do to help refugees learn about Canada and integrate more effectively? I'll start with you, Senator, because you worked in that space for so long.
I think our resettlement sector is mature and diverse. I think if a refugee regardless of which age or which ethnicity prefers to have services in their language, that option is open to them. But if they also prefer to go to a multi-service agency, you know, where they are provided with services in English, then that's also open to them. I think there's a famous saying: you start with bonding capital and then you go to bridging capital, you know, and that bridge already exists in, at least in the big cities in Canada. You have, you know, in Toronto, where I come from, an Afghan refugee can go to COSTI, which is a multi-service agency, or it can go to the Afghan Women's Organization, which is more of an ethnic-based organization. So I think it may be a mischaracterization of the choices that are available to refugees where they tend to go the most, which is the big cities, frankly. Now, if they're going to New Brunswick, as Bayan is trying to do, well, that's a whole different matter, and we need to think about that. I'm very sensitive to the needs of refugee women in particular. And I think there are many refugee women, again, I'm going to hark back to my experiences with the Syrian families, where the women are much more comfortable in learning about settlement and learning English within their own cultural community for many, many, many reasons. We need to give them time. We cannot expect them to be remolded on the day of arrival, if we want to even call it that. They need to evolve at their own space, at their own time, at their own, on their own will. I am, you know, I talk about this one Syrian family that I sponsored, that, you know, they're so close to my heart. I have done so many things in my life, but I always tear up when I think about them, because I think that is likely the best thing I have ever done. But the matriarch in the family, the mother of 8 children, she is quite happy to stay at home and not learn English. We have tried our best. But her children are doing well in school. They have a roof over their heads. They're paying their bills. They're going to become citizens, except her, because she doesn't speak English. And there are some things in life, I think, we just have to accept. You know, I don't know what else to say. You can't force people into a mold. This is not the country that does that.
Yeah, well, I know people who have been in Canada for 30 years and still don't speak the language. And the nice thing is you can still manage. But for me, what's always so breathtaking is the success of the children
Yes.
in those instances. I think we're running rapidly out of time, so there are a couple of questions that are in the list. I'll just flag. People asked about resources. They asked specifically about Lifeline Afghanistan. In the follow-up email, we will provide a fulsome list of things that you can be referred to if you would like more information. I think, from my point of view, I'd like to end by with one of the questions, which is, what role do all of us play in supporting refugee resettlement? And I wonder if we can just go around the virtual room, maybe starting with you, Bayan, this time, to talk about what you want people on this call today. Remember, there are donors, there are educators, there are ordinary people. The floor is yours. What should they do?
Well, I think our discussion today shows us that Canada needs refugees to succeed, because when refugees succeed, Canada succeeds. And the second thing is that the world needs Canada to succeed in refugee integration, because Canada is one of the last champions of pluralism and an example to the world of the benefits and beauty of pluralism. So at the end of the day, what we all have to do is ask ourselves, how can we help? How can we be a part of that solution? And there are so many different things that you can do. You can become a friend with a refugee. You can introduce them to people in your network. If you're an employer, you can hire refugees. You can volunteer at the many, many organizations that support refugees. And like I said, again, if you just really don't know and you want to chat about it, I would be more than happy to talk to any one of you about what you can do, what makes sense for you, what are the pathways for you to be a part of this.
Thanks so much. And Dr. Ibrahim, next, what do you want people on the call to do?
I think I want people on the call to push the government to cut the red tape and not have the UNHCR designation for the Afghan refugees, and mobilize quickly like they did for the Ukrainians. I think the people on this call can push the government to do that. And I think in terms of I'm going to make a substantial contribution towards the refugees coming from Afghanistan. And I'm sure if this path becomes clearer and easy without red tape, I can get a lot of my friends and business associates to contribute as well. And I don't think, similar to what happened with Lifeline Syria, I don't think there will be a shortage of funds. It's just that, and there will be families that will want to sponsor. So if we can get rid of the red tape, and if we can get rid of this UNHCR designation, and if we can really put it on fast track, I think we can really get a lot of refugees here and make it good for them as well as for Canada.
And I just wanted to underscore Senator Ahmedvar's colleague, Alan Rock, former Justice Minister, said very clearly, there's a lot of ministerial discretion. There's a lot of power in that office to simply say, make it so. Last word to you, Senator Ahmedvar.
What can we do?
Yeah.
In addition to all the wonderful ideas of my very wise colleagues, I'm going to pitch individual action. Become a sponsor. There's nothing quite like that. I promise you, it will transform your life. It will transform the life of your family. If you are looking for glue to connect with other people in your community, outside your community, this is the glue. All the research on private sponsorship comes with two conclusions, evidence-based. One, the refugees do better. Two, the sponsors do better. The sponsors do better because, in this fractured world where we are all in our own little social media worlds, this is a project that builds community and that is action-oriented, that results in celebration. 7 years after my first experience, we are still going to celebrate every Canada Day in the park with our huge family of sponsors, their families, their brothers and sisters, and our refugees, their brothers and sisters and their families. It's a wonderful, wonderful way of getting grounded and understanding how very privileged we are in this country.
I want to thank all of our panelists, all of the attendees. I want to thank our lead sponsor, TD Bank Group, and also the promotional partners for this event, the Association of Fundraising Professionals of Greater Toronto Chapter, the Canadian Association of Gift Planners, Canada Helps, Imagine Canada, and Community Foundations Canada. Really, you know, philanthropy is a core value, whatever faith you have or whether you're secular. It really is a core value in Canada. And I hope you've heard today from the panel why a focus on refugees makes such good sense for the country and for us all. So thank you very much.